In Keynes's model of the macroeconomy, everything revolves around demand, and demand means spending. So the first task in building a Keynesian model of the macroeconomy is to carefully describe the spending plans of the different sectors of the economy. So let's begin by listing the sectors of the economy and looking at how to describe their spending plans. There are households, there are businesses, there is the government, and there are foreigners. And each of these sectors has its own spending plans. Households are consumers, and their spending is called consumption spending. Business spending on plant, equipment, and tools is called investment. Government spending on roads, bridges, public goods, and other things. And net exports is the net spending of foreigners on our goods, less what we spend on theirs. Each of these components of aggregate spending is measured in real terms. Although we may refer to total dollars spent on consumption, when we're talking about real spending, those dollars are inflation adjusted. And rather than referring to money, they refer to baskets of consumer goods. They refer to stuff that consumers actually buy. Now, if you look at what consumers are planning to spend, what businesses are planning to spend, the government and foreigners, and you add them together, you get a measure that we call aggregate expenditure. And aggregate expenditure depends on other variables in the environment. For example, consumer spending is heavily influenced by income and wealth. Business spending is heavily influenced by the interest rate. Foreign spending is influenced by the exchange rate. And if we add together the combined spending plans of households, businesses, government, and foreigners, we get what Keynes might call aggregate expenditure, or aggregate planned spending. Aggregate planned spending is the sum of the spending plans of all of the individual sectors in the economy. So now we have it, aggregate expenditure, what the economy is planning to spend. Looking ahead, what we're going to imagine happening next is a comparison between what people in the economy are planning to spend and how much stuff there is actually in the economy to buy. Because if there's a discrepancy between what people are planning to spend and what has actually been produced, businesses are going to find that all of the goods don't leave the shelves. That is, some stuff is left behind. And what businesses have to do in that case is make an unplanned investment. We call this unintended inventory accumulation. And unintended inventory accumulation is the difference between the output of the economy and the combined spending plans of all of the players in the economy. Looking forward then, you can imagine that the equilibrium in Keynes's model is going to be a situation in which all spending is planned spending. That is, in which the income that's actually created in the economy is just enough to promote the spending on those goods so that all the goods that are produced are actually intentionally purchased by the people in the economy. What we're going to do now in order to get to a more thorough understanding of this equilibrium is look at each of these components of aggregate expenditure in turn and explain them. We're going to start with consumer spending because it's the most important and largest component of spending, and understanding it is going to help us understand basically the structure of this model. So let's start with consumer spending. Consumer spending is a function of other variables in the environment. And to understand this better, think about what influences your own decision to buy stuff. That is, what does your planned spending depend upon? Well, here down below, I've written a consumption function that summarizes the variables that influence consumer spending. That is, the amount of stuff that households buy in a year. It's going to be a function, first of all, of autonomous spending. This is the stuff that you have to buy, no matter what else is going on in the economy. This is food, clothing, shelter, your basic necessities. This is stuff you would go into debt to buy, even if you had no income. The second component is your wealth. When your savings is bigger, you have more money in your mutual funds, you're more likely to consume. Next, income. The higher your income, the more you have to spend. And income is especially important when you are liquidity constrained. That is, whenever you have less ability to borrow at the bank, then what you're able to spend in a given year is more tightly tied to your paycheck. The availability of credit would increase the amount that you would buy in a year. Taxes also have an effect. The higher your taxes, the less money is left over for consumer spending. The price level is important, but not in the way that might seem immediately obvious. That is, when you go to the store, if prices are higher on the shelf, It's not that you really care, because your income is higher also. That is, if your paycheck is increasing at the same rate as consumer prices, then the prices are irrelevant. You still buy the same amount of stuff. Your real consumer spending is unchanged. The problem comes in when the price rises relative to your savings account, because typically your savings, your mutual funds, other wealth is denominated in nominal terms, that is, in fixed dollar amounts, so that when the price level rises, the purchasing power of your savings shrinks, and that inclines you to spend less, to buy less stuff. So the consumption function can be very complex. It can depend on a lot of other variables like demographic factors. Your age may influence how much you spend, the part of the country, the weather, all of this stuff. But in order to build a simple model to explain the Keynesian notion that demand drives the economy, we're going to look at consumption dependent primarily on two factors. First of all, a notion of autonomous consumption, what you'd spend in the absence of any income. And next, income as a driver of consumption. All of these other variables we're going to hold constant. They're either going to be subsumed into this autonomous component, that is, we could change them by changing the amount of autonomous spending you do, or they're going to be just held constant, zapped with ceteris paribus. So now that we've got a consumption function, a notion of a consumption function, let me show you how we represent that more thoroughly in the Keynesian model. Let me start with a consumption schedule. Suppose this is a description of a particular consumer's behavior. We show here that consumption spending depends on income. As income increases, consumer spending increases. With an income of 40, this consumer spends 42. With an income of 50, the consumer spends 50, exactly what he or she is earning. And finally, with an income of 80, there's consumer spending of 74, with some left over for savings. Now, these numbers show a positive relationship between income and consumption. And if I wanted to look at lots of other income levels and lots of other consumption numbers associated with them, I could do so and summarize them in a simple algebraic equation. This simple algebraic equation is a linear consumption function, a simple linear Keynesian consumption function that's going to look like this. Y is the consumer income. And what we're going to do is we're going to multiply that consumer income by a letter B. B in this case is the marginal propensity to consume, or the MPC. What B tells you is the fraction of each additional dollar of income that the consumer spends. That is, for example, if B is 0.5 or 50 cents, the consumer spends 50 cents out of each additional dollar that is added to his or her income. So B is the marginal propensity to consume, and Y is income, the amount of extra spending that's added to the consumer's plans by an increase in income. Now, if we take that and we add to it an autonomous component, A, then we get consumer spending, a linear consumption function. The spending looks like this. A plus marginal propensity to consume times income is equal to consumption. C equals A plus BY. This is a nice, simple, linear consumption function. Now let's draw a graph of this function, but if we're going to draw a graph, we need to plug in some real numbers to make it a bit more concrete. Suppose I take an algebraic formula that generates the numbers that we just looked at in the previous table. Let's suppose that the autonomous spending is 10. That is, no matter what your income is, you're going to spend at least $10 on food, clothing, and shelter. And let's suppose further that the marginal propensity to consume is equal to 8/10. That is, out of each additional dollar that the consumer earns, the consumer is going to spend 80 cents on consumption. So here's the consumption function. Real consumer spending is equal to 10 plus 8/10 times real income. Well, let's draw a graph of that formula now. First thing we're going to do is use red to represent consuming, the consumption function, and take an intercept here of 10, because if income is 0, that is, if we're right here in a graph with consumption on the vertical axis and income on the horizontal axis, 0 income is represented by the vertical intercept of this curve. So let's put here the vertical intercept is 10, because if income is 0, consumption will be equal to 10. Then the slope of the line will be equal to the marginal propensity to consume. That is, for every additional dollar that the consumer gets in income, that is, for an increase in income of $1 or a horizontal increase of 1, there's going to be a vertical increase of 8/10. 8/10 is the additional consumption that results whenever the consumer gets $1 additional dollar in income. So here we have the slope of this curve is going to be the rise, or the change in consumption, divided by the run, or the change in income. So if we have the change in consumption divided by the change in income, the rise over the run, that's simply going to be the marginal propensity to consume, the extra consumption you do when your income increases by $1. If Y increases by 1, consumption increases by 80 cents. So that's the slope then of this curve. Now let me put in another curve, and this curve represents income. That is, the black dotted line that I'm now drawing in the diagram represents all of those points where C is equal to Y. All of those points where the amount of money that people are spending is equal exactly to the income that they've earned. So this black dotted line represents all the points where consumption is equal to income. Now, let's see what we notice here in this picture. Here's a point right here where consumption and income are equal. This is a point where savings would be equal to 0, and this is a point where consumers don't have to either save or dissave. They have to do neither. That is, they simply spend their paycheck as they get it. But if you take an income that's lower, so let's take this income level right here. We'll call this Y1. At this lower level of income, then the amount of money that consumers are planning to spend exceeds the amount of income that they've received. And the gap between the red line, the planned spending, and the black dotted line, the income received, that gap is going to have to be made up for by drawing down your savings. We call that dis-savings. In all of these points in here, the consumer is dis-saving because the red line is above the black dotted line. That is, consumer spending that consumers are planning to do exceeds the income that they've received. If we go beyond the break-even point, say to a point like this one, I could call this level of income Y2. And at Y2, if I follow Y2 all the way up to my graph, I get a consumption plan that involves a lower amount of spending than the consumer income. Up here, consumer income exceeds planned consumer spending. So what are you going to do with the rest of the money? The consumer is going to put it into savings. So the difference between actual income received and the consumption that's carried out, that's going to be savings in this case, the gap between the red line and the black dotted line. So in this region down here, we have dis-savings. That is, savings, the amount of money that's saved, is going to be less than 0 for any income below this break-even point. And I could call this Y sub B for consumption is breaking even with income. And if I go beyond this point up here, then savings is going to be positive in this region because consumption is going to be less than income received. So there you have it. In certain instances, we're going to have income less than consumption. In this case, the consumer is going to be dis-savings. In other cases, the consumer will be breaking even with his income by his planned spending. And in other cases, income is going to be greater than consumption, so the consumer can actually do some savings. We're going to look next at the relationship between consumption and savings. But keep in mind that what we're doing here is we're building a model that explains the macroeconomy based on demand. And the first step that we're taking is to describe the behavior of consumers, to show how their demand, their consumer spending, depends on their income and other factors. And we've summarized their behavior in this diagram, which shows that as income increases, consumers spend more money.